Chapter 25. It was a chilly evening the day after Merlin Griffiths had been shot. Following his visit to Wyndham Spencer James, Martin James returned to the Apple House. When he came back into the small space, Martin immediately set about clearing the ash out of the wood stove. He used the small brush and pan that someone had left behind. There was no need to go out again except for some wood, and he did that immediately the stove caught. The evening was beginning to close in. There was the smell of wood smoke drifting over from the kindling, and he thought he heard an owl. He went back into the small house, carrying an armful of hazel logs. After he'd done this for a second time, he closed the door and put his hands out towards the wood stove. There was little warmth yet. He supposed it would take a while. He would just have to be patient. Ever since his argument with Samantha over what had happened with Queenie, he'd been trying to go easy on himself. But the shooting had been disturbing. There was no doubt about that. He couldn't help thinking that the shot that had hit Merlin Griffiths could just as easily have been meant for him. That someone was trying to warn him off. Of course, it could have been an accident, but he found that unlikely. If his immediate reactions had been to refuse to be intimidated, to push his queries further, and to go and see Fionn Roberts and later Wyndham Spencer James, that was partly because he had been wrong-footed before, and he didn't want to make the same mistake again. If it had been a mistake. The fact that he had slept with Queenie was obviously not going to lead to an affair, or even to being closer to her. She had taken pains not to be left alone with him for more than a few minutes ever since it had happened. Perhaps Sam had been right. Queenie only slept with men she wasn't particularly attracted to. In the long run, that made the situation between them easier to deal with. So that was not what was bothering him now. Not particularly. It occupied a place towards the back of his thoughts. It informed his dealing with Queenie, but it didn't really illuminate anything. So much had happened that he was beginning to feel that some of the carefully assembled parts of his old self no longer held together in the same way. He opened the door of the wood stove and placed some thicker sticks of wood over the dying kindling. The hazel was obviously dry and hard and more than ready to burn. His meeting with Wyndham Spencer James early in the afternoon had not been a success. He could see that clearly now. Perhaps he should have taken more time. What was it that Marion Keynes had quoted? He tried to remember it as best he could. It is knowing that the true nature of mind is the true nature of everything. Well, even if it were true, it hardly helped him now that things seemed more, not less complicated. Even introspection left him with a series of questions. Why, for instance, did Wyndham Spencer James want Plas Wern Las so badly? What had the nature of his relationship with Parker Merriam really been? He was thinking about this and trying not to dwell on the way Samantha Merriam looked when she turned towards the light. She had a translucence then, a cool, ethereal quality that seemed to promise a kind of repose. But could he be wrong about her? Could it be dangerous? Shouldn't he really try and concentrate on a more obvious affinity with someone, say, like Fionn Roberts, who was bright, articulate, capable, and probably much more straightforward? What was the matter with him? He started to stoke the wood stove with some of the really thick logs when there was a knock on the door. He opened it to see a small, dark-haired man of about 25 standing there shivering in a dark grey t-shirt. Sam says it's her turn to cook, so she wanted me to check on the numbers, Simon Merriam said. Until then, Martin hadn't been sure whether Samantha's brother was still around. She did? Some kind of ratatouille, she said. She hates to make too much. So she sent you? Is anything the matter with that? Martin considered his reply. This was probably the closest he had been to Simon Merriam since he had to restrain him during his outburst in the churchyard. Because of his affection for Sam, this was not a situation he wanted to misjudge. I didn't know you were still here, he said after a while. Don't have much to go back to, do I? Lost my job last month. Sorry to hear that. Are you? Yes, as a matter of fact, I know what it feels like. Martin looked across to Simon. Then he spoke again. I suppose you're going to tell me, in my case, at least I knew I had an inheritance. Well, didn't you? Wasn't as straightforward as that, Martin began. Simon Merriam sat down. Martin chose the bed. You can't buy me, you know. The sudden remark disconcerted him, but Martin tried to play down his reaction. Pardon, he said, trying to practice the patience he'd been thinking about earlier. I know you fancy my sister, that's obvious, but there's no need to be nice to me because of it. Perhaps you ought to give yourself a chance. Don't you mean give you a chance? I meant what I said. Martin waited while Simon Merriam looked around the small space. It was difficult to tell his exact attitude. This is quite nice. I could live here, Simon Merriam said. Could you? If I had to. As it is, I have to go back to London tomorrow. Sam asked me to ask you if you could give me a lift to the station. Apparently the others have to take the car into the garage first, so they won't be going to town till later. Martin couldn't get used to the odd combination of need and disdain that came from Samantha's brother. There was a jerky kind of uncertainty about him that he found unsettling. What time do you have to leave? He said after a while. Around 8. My train leaves at 9. To be back in London by the afternoon. Friend visiting. Okay. Really? I said. Great. Simon Merriam hoisted himself out of the Windsor chair. Tell Sam you'll be there for dinner then, shall I? Please. Could you also tell her that she's going to come tomorrow, then I've got to stop off at the old rectory and pick up my Uncle Paul on the way back. I hope she'll be all right with that. It's a promise I can't break. She hasn't been there since he died, you know. So she might like it. I was the one who went and sorted out the things. It was an odd remark, Martin remembered thinking at the time, but its full implications only emerged the next day. For the moment, he stowed it away to consider it later. Simon Merriam left the Apple House, and 20 minutes or so later, Martin followed him across to the main house for dinner. She was unusually quiet as they began the winding descent down to Gwendraeth rectory. She was quiet, and she pushed herself back into her seat. Stray strands of dark hair poked out the sides of her woolen hat, and the paleness of her skin was accentuated. She was wearing an old denim jacket with a black skirt and long boots. It was not the first time Martin had noticed that she possessed an odd incongruity of style. She had a knack of making things work, Samantha. Now, pushed back into the seat of the Land Rover, it was hard to tell what she was thinking. Earlier, when they had dropped her brother off at the railway station, Samantha had been lively, even making jokes. But almost as soon as they had left him in the carriage waiting for the train to leave, a change had come over her. It was not that Martin felt that she was tense, far from it. He was glad to be in the Land Rover with her. Even for the moment, he had no idea what it meant. The track broke free of the winding descent. The grade began to diminish, and there, in front of them, was the glittering sea. A few minutes earlier, they had passed the place where Paul's car, driven by Parker Merriam, had gone over the edge. Neither of them had said anything, perhaps because they had been unwilling to break the odd but quite settled quietness that lay between them. Martin couldn't help thinking of that day only a few weeks ago when he had first seen Gwendraeth James again and caught a fleeting glimpse of the dead body in the gully. He was very quiet when he was here, you know. Samantha suddenly broke the silence. Who? My father, of course. Sometimes he didn't even phone. That must have been annoying. Not particularly. Why? If you wanted to see him. Samantha smoothed the stray hair back into place. It's obvious you didn't know my father. He wasn't a coal man. But he was certainly a contained one. If he didn't want contact, then he didn't. Still. Still what? Frustrating? Samantha flung open the door of the Land Rover. You learn to live with a lot of love that's bottled up, I suppose. What else can you do? There was a silence. Martin didn't know quite what to say. They stood there, between the sea and the rectory, a rapprochement of sorts between the two of them. He wondered fleetingly what she would do if he took her hand and led her quietly down the path to the dunes. But he thought he knew the answer to that too. She would say no. You understand I don't want to go in? He nodded. She gestured towards the old rectory. It's just that if I hardly went there when he's alive, there's not much point now he's dead, is there? Martin nodded and left her standing in the car park next to the Land Rover. He walked across to the rectory. There was no one in the annex, and his Uncle Paul was waiting, sitting in a wheelchair with the rug over his knees on the back patio. The hill reared up behind him, but he had managed to find a patch of sunlight into which he'd steered himself. Conservatives like to leave you to fend for yourself, he said with a slight smile. And Martin realized that was the first joke his uncle had made since he'd summoned him down from London all those weeks ago. Paul's bright mood held until the late morning. In the harbour town of Abersarn, the tide was beginning to turn. Small boats bobbed in the wind away from the neck of the harbour, where it had begun to turn blustery. The odd combination of Martin James, his Uncle Paul, and Samantha Merriam had made a slow tour of the seafront and was now heading towards the shelter of the inner harbour. Martin felt pleased, if oddly distanced from himself. Though there was more than an element of duty in what he was doing for Paul, there was also the knowledge that, despite the distinct difference in temperament and personal philosophy between him and his uncle, there was also a bond that could not easily be eradicated. Samantha's presence formed a kind of bridge between them. They both obviously liked her. In here, I think, Paul said, waving his arm towards the cafe that sold coffee and honey ice cream. Martin wheeled his uncle into the cafe and found a place for the wheelchair in the far corner, where a round table offered a different view of the harbour. Across the other side, a collection of bright, painted Georgian townhouses declined in size towards the sea. Almost too elegant for Wales, I've always thought, Paul said. Is that because you're a Puritan? Samantha's question surprised Martin in its directness. He could never have teased Paul like that. and he wondered if she could get away with it. "Well hidden," Paul said, looking towards her. "But well done." Her presence had a tonic effect, Martin thought, and not only on Paul. "There was something I wanted to say to you," Paul said a little later. "Yes?" "I always did what I thought was best." "Yes?" "Do you want me to leave?" Samantha asked suddenly. "No." Paul reached out and placed his hand over hers. "In fact, I don't think I could say this without your presence. I owe you an apology," he said to Martin. "In fact, more than one. Like you said, I know you've always done. Don't interrupt me, please. I owe your father something too. Because I've never been one for standing by gravesides. Never. Something about the whole process disturbs me. The bones, the rotting into nothingness. That's why I had them both cremated after the accident. And in a way, that's why I had to dispose of everything in the house, including Henrietta's papers. And that's what I want to tell you about." But that was inevitable, surely at some stage. Samantha's turn to say something. Paul raised his hands. It was a wet afternoon when I decided. As dark and as wet as the day your father drove into the cement lorry. "Is that what it was?" Samantha said. But Paul went on speaking. "I remember standing in that damn drawing room with the auctioneer. I'd called him at first to get a valuation. You see, after your father was gone, I was going to be responsible for everything. Along with the other trustees, of course. But Merlin Griffiths was content to let me handle the personal family details. So I remember it, you see. The darkness, if you like. In the room of darkness. I was standing with him, Arthur James, a short, portly man in a loud check suit. No relation. I was standing with him in front of the fireplace next to a dark green settee covered in some flowery material. I hated it. I hated the wet. The darkness, the sound of the water, in spite of the elegance, the well-proportioned fireplace, the 6-over-6 windows that came down to about knee height. I hated it. I felt not only was the place responsible for the death of my aunt, the brutal murder that was still unsolved, but also in some way I blamed it for the death of my brother. I was 60 myself, but your father was only in his 40s. He had everything before him. But I thought then, and to an extent I still think now, that house sucked the life out of him. Martin took a sip of his coffee. That doesn't make sense, strictly, does it? But Paul had already started to speak again. For nearly 20 years he managed it. As soon as he came into his majority, he moved into that house. He spent money on the roof instead of on clothes. He ate frugally and he cut the hedges himself. Your father, Martin, was like a man possessed. I would try and get him to come up to Hampstead for a weekend or two every year. But even walking down England's Lane or on our way to the Heath, you could see his heart wasn't in it. There was a mysterious look in his eyes, and I knew he was here in Wales, in the house that was eating him up. There was another pause. Paul looked out of the window for a moment, and then he said, "That was why, you understand. That was why I instructed the auctioneer that very afternoon that instead of just auditing the contents of the place, he might as well go ahead and start the arrangements for getting rid of it all." "Where was I when you decided?" Suddenly, Martin wanted to know. "You were in a house in Carmarthen. I hired someone to look after you. What were you, after all? 5? A house with a long garden at the back. And a tree." "I think so, yes. Belonged to Anne Davis's sister." "The old housekeeper?" "Yes. Why?" "I think I remember it." Samantha now put her other hand gently on top of Paul's. "So you got rid of everything, except the house itself?" "There's an auction, eventually. Yes. A few months or so later." "Because you couldn't stand it?" "Yes." "In the circumstances, that's understandable enough," Samantha said. She turned towards Martin. "Don't you think so?" Martin felt quiet and bleak. The water in the harbour seemed to have turned choppy, and the boats bobbed up and down. He couldn't explain why he was taking it so hard, why his feelings towards his Uncle Paul were so ambivalent. Part of him, he supposed, felt deprived at a chance of a continuity of purpose, a line that stretched down from his great-uncle through his aunts and his father. The other part of him understood, or thought he did. It was only so much disturbance any one person could stand, after all. Paul had obviously made the best choice he could, given the circumstances. The fact that 30 years later he had regrets was understandable too. He was obviously paying for his mistake, if it was a mistake. His previous brightness now seemed to be a forced vitality. He looked yellower in the declining afternoon light. "I think it's time we probably went," Martin said after a while. He didn't have much else left to say. He paid the bill and moved closer to his uncle to show that, while he didn't share his beliefs, he didn't bear him any obvious ill will. He waited for a while, and then he began to push the wheelchair out of the cafe. When they got outside and walked towards the Land Rover, gulls wheeled overhead. It seemed to Martin that they were bigger than they had been when he was a boy. They dropped Paul off at the rectory and drove back towards Plas Wern Las in a quietness. The diesel engine chuntered as they climbed, and he concentrated on the narrow, twisting roads. He wanted to see Samantha's face, to see what she was thinking if he could, but there was little opportunity. She was not impassive, but it was as if she was resting for the moment. She was content to be with him, and that ought to have been enough. But part of him wanted more, a kind of confirmation of their temporary togetherness. It wasn't forthcoming. He knew that she was going to leave him when they drew into the forecourt of Plas Wern Las. He knew this, and there was nothing he could do about it. It felt like a thread was being deliberately broken, that the unspoken thing between them was being dispensed with. He parked the Land Rover, and they went into the front hallway together. He was careful not to say anything or even touch her arm, for fear of destroying what remained of their invisible connection. A shaft of light came down into the vestibule from the top. There was dust in the beam, and it was clearly visible to him. And there, in a kind of suspended moment, she turned towards him as she began to climb the curved stairway. She turned towards him and she smiled. And he knew that despite everything that was being broken, that things between them were going to be all right, even if it was on a different level. It was that very potential that made him restive. If he had known that it was all over forever, then he supposed he would have been able to settle. He might have gone for a walk, or found an axe and chopped some wood, or gone out and climbed the hill, and shouted until he felt better. As it was, he paced the apple house until he couldn't stand it any longer, and then he went out with a small brush and brushed out the back of the Land Rover, and tidied the tools in the toolbox, and even looked around to see if David Young was about. But he and Marion Keynes had not yet returned from the art exhibition in Carmarthen. That left Queenie, who was about somewhere, probably in the kitchen. But he did not want to be seen to be tracking her. So after he had finished with the Land Rover, he started to go for a walk down the drive, and then he changed his mind and went back into the house through the front door. Immediately, the sound of a cello reverberated down from above. There was a strong running bass line complemented by a higher, almost vocal, twisting insinuation. He did not recognize the piece, but he thought it might be Bach. He had no hesitation in what he was doing. He followed the sound across the vestibule, up the stairs, along the corridor, and into the room on the left, where he found her sitting on a stool, playing. Her hair had fallen over part of her face, and she played with a deep, intense concentration that he knew would be fatal to interrupt. She did not look up, but he hoped she knew that he was there. He stood quietly in the doorway for a minute or two, and then he moved as silently as he could towards the bed. She continued to play. She was obviously working something out. The running notes at the bottom were complemented by a series of interrogatives. These wove between the others, and at the same time almost formed a separate series. He sat on the bed and listened. He did not even look at her. When she had finished, she brushed her hair away from her eyes, looked over to where he was sitting, and said, "Not here." He went over towards her then, and she put the cello back into its case. He took her hand and he led her down the stairs, through the back of Plas Wern Las, and towards the apple house. He could hear his heart beating. When it was over, she turned to him and said, "If I had known it was going to be like this, I would have done it before." She surprised him now, like she had surprised him earlier. Her quick, passionate responses had thrown him off guard. He'd been prepared for a delicate seduction, if that was what was needed. He'd been ready to go as slowly as he dared, but it proved to be unnecessary. Samantha had responded with a deep and affirmative passion that had taken him off guard and made him realize that, even though he'd taken the initiative, the choice had not really been his. On some level, she'd been waiting for him, and all that he needed was the strength to realize it. "Well, aren't you going to say something?" He hadn't actively realized that he'd been quiet. He had somehow been thinking around it all in a floating series of images that were not connected by a logical thread. He saw her, for instance, like the day she was in church, the day of her father's funeral. She was playing with an intense, almost angry concentration, working out her own solution with music of a strident and piercing intensity. Her face was somewhat obscured, and her hands were long and thin and white and bony. Then he saw her as she had been that day on the hilltop, running away from him with quick, active movements and not looking back. Had she been jealous then? Was that something he'd missed? And before she'd just spoken, he'd seen her as she'd been earlier in the day, turning up her collar against the wind on the end of the pier at Abersarn. Taller, more angular than he'd previously realized, and more determined. Sorry. Yes? I was thinking about you. Isn't that what you say to everyone? No, it isn't. He was reaching down to pull some of the bed covers back over them when he heard a noise outside. When he looked up, he knew there was someone at the window, but he couldn't see who it was. Soon after that, he heard voices, followed by a loud knocking on the door. Annoyed, he pulled on a pair of jeans and a sweater. When he opened the door, he found himself looking at Gwendraeth James, closely followed by his assistant, the thin sergeant with the hair that stuck out at odd angles. So you don't believe in privacy, Gwendraeth, he'd said, and things had gone downhill from there. It wasn't that he'd blamed his former schoolmate for following up on things as vigilantly as he had. That was only to be expected. Even 20 years ago, on the rugby field, Gwendraeth James had been known for his dogged persistence. He obviously hadn't changed much. No, what bothered Martin now was that despite what had happened between them, he still hadn't told Samantha everything else that had occurred. He hadn't told her, for example, about the shooting of Merlin Griffiths in the Coracle and his later encounters with both Fionn Roberts and Wyndham Spencer James. He couldn't say why exactly. It was as if he'd found the situation between the two of them to be too tentative already. Or perhaps it had been that he was too used to conducting his life in compartments, where one event was not allowed to reverberate against another, because he was not quite sure he could control the consequences. Whatever it was, he paid for it as soon as Gwendraeth and his sergeant began their questions about the shooting of the solicitor. You didn't tell me, Samantha said to him directly. I didn't want to worry you. He could hear that his own voice was flat, and it seemed a feeble excuse to him, even as he said it. He watched as she pulled on her shoes, and he could feel her going away from him in front of witnesses, and there was not a lot that he could do about it. Then she said, I can't be protected from everything just because my father's dead. I'd appreciate it if you could learn that. She finished with her shoes, and then, after making her excuses to Gwendraeth, she left the apple house. He felt a bleakness as he watched her go. And as soon as Gwendraeth told him that he probably should have told her about the shooting, he flared up at him. He knew that his behaviour was not the most advisable, but at that point, he didn't care. Gwendraeth James was too close to him in the small room, and a lot of their old antagonism surfaced. He knew what he'd always known, that Gwendraeth James thought he was effete, an overprivileged boarder who lacked the knockabout resilience of the day boys. Someone who hadn't really had to worry about money or a career. The fact that most of this was inaccurate, a series of misconceptions piled one on top of the other, didn't help anything. If anything, the resurfacing of the old antagonisms made him more angry. It locked him into a situation where it felt like he wasn't even free to express his own responses. He didn't want to tell Gwendraeth, for example, the exact reason why he'd been to see Merlin Griffiths on the river. How could he, anyway, express the building unease he was experiencing about his aunt's death all those years ago? Why was it so important? And if it was, why did he have to try to express it to someone with whom he only had a limited affinity, despite their relatively close knowledge of each other. And most of all, what business of Gwendraeth James was it if he'd gone to bed with Samantha? Why the hell did he have to know anything at all about that? So when the questions began, he tried to keep his cool. Tried not to rise to the obvious fact that he felt his life was being intruded upon. That even some of his half-formed connections were not completely articulated, even to himself. Most of all, he tried not to respond to what he felt was Gwendraeth James's sometimes bludgeoning style. In some ways, he felt that Harry Warden was easier to respond to. So, when he was trying to tell about his suspicions about the death of his Aunt Henrietta and Parker Merriam, and the latter said, "You're saying that the two deaths are connected despite the fact that they're 50 years apart?" He almost felt a sense of relief. He knew that they were listening to him when he sat down on the Windsor chair and began to talk. He didn't know that he would be able to patch it up with Samantha. His aunt's murder kept rising from the past into the present and threatening some sort of connection with Parker Merriam's death. He also knew that he was disturbed by the recently discovered link between Parker and Wyndham Spencer James. In the middle of all this, his solicitor, the one person he'd begun to trust, gets sniped at. So he told them all of it, and as he did so, he could feel Gwendraeth James watching him very closely, as if he was formulating some alternative theory of his own. When he stopped speaking, there was a silence, and then Gwendraeth James said, "So you're sure you didn't see anyone from the coracle?" Martin James shook his head. The conflict between him and Gwendraeth seemed to be over for the moment. He needed them to leave the apple house and let him find what was left of his own equilibrium. When Gwendraeth James got up, he seemed preoccupied, even thoughtful. Martin couldn't remember seeing him quite like that before. When they opened the door to leave, he noticed there was a steady drizzle coming down from outside. He was grateful for the distraction.